You wake up in the morning, and before your feet even touch the floor, your mind has already begun speaking. It reminds you of yesterday's embarrassment. It rehearses tomorrow's problems. It compares your life to someone else's. It replays conversations that no longer exist. It predicts futures that have not happened. And most of the time, you never consciously choose any of it. The voice simply appears, constant, automatic, familiar enough that you mistake it for yourself. But what if that voice is not the real you at all? What if much of your suffering, your anxiety, your self-doubt, your mental exhaustion, even your identity, is being generated by a hidden system inside the brain, operating quietly in the background? A system that becomes most active when you are doing absolutely nothing. Modern neuroscience calls it the default mode network. And despite its clinical name, this network may be one of the most psychologically powerful forces shaping human experience. Because the brain is not silent when you rest. The moment external tasks disappear, the mind turns inward. It begins constructing stories about who you are, what others think of you, what the future might become, and what the past supposedly meant. Your attention leaves reality and enters simulation. You call it thinking, but often it is rehearsal, prediction, self-construction, a looping theater of identity. And centuries before brain scanners existed, philosophers and spiritual traditions warned about this hidden machinery. The Buddha described the restless mind as a source of suffering. Friedrich Nietzsche warned that human beings become trapped inside inherited narratives. Carl Jung believed unseen psychic forces quietly govern behavior beneath awareness. Now, neuroscience is uncovering something unsettling. They may all have been observing the same phenomenon from different angles, because the mind you experience every day may not be a transparent reflection of reality. It may be a controlled hallucination, shaped by memory, prediction, emotion, and survival. And if that is true, then one terrifying question emerges. If the voice inside your head is constantly constructing who you are, who would you be without it? For most of human history, people assumed consciousness worked like a window. You looked outward, you perceived reality, you reacted accordingly. Simple. But modern neuroscience has revealed something far stranger. Your brain is not passively observing the world, it is actively constructing it. And at the center of that construction sits the default mode network, a group of interconnected brain regions that become most active when your attention is no longer focused on the external environment. In other words, when you stop doing, the brain begins narrating. The network includes regions like the medial prefrontal cortex, posterior cingulate cortex, and angular gyrus. Together, they help generate autobiographical memory, simulate the future, model social situations, and maintain your sense of self across time. This system is extraordinarily useful. Without it, you could not imagine tomorrow. You could not learn from the past. You could not build identity, morality, or long-term goals. But the same mechanism that allows self-awareness also creates psychological imprisonment, because the brain evolved for survival, not truth. And survival depends heavily on prediction. Long before you consciously react to reality, the brain is already anticipating it. Neuroscientists increasingly describe perception itself as predictive processing. The brain constantly generates internal models of the world, then updates them through sensory input. You do not merely see reality. You see the brain's best survival-oriented guess about reality, which means much of your experience is shaped not by what is happening, but by what your nervous system expects to happen. This is why two people can experience the same event and emerge with completely different realities. One sees rejection, another sees freedom. One sees uncertainty, another sees possibility. The external event matters less than the internal model interpreting it. And the default mode network acts like the narrator, maintaining those models over time. It continuously asks, what does this mean about me? That question becomes the center of psychological identity. A failure becomes, I am not enough. An embarrassment becomes, people always judge me. A painful childhood becomes, this is who I permanently are. Over time, isolated experiences become narrative architecture, and eventually, the story feels more real than direct experience itself. This is why your mind can continue suffering inside a perfectly safe room. The body sits in the present. The nervous system lives in memory and prediction. Arthur Schopenhauer once wrote that humans are not free to will what they will. He understood something neuroscience now increasingly supports. Much of mental life arises automatically before conscious awareness catches up. Thoughts appear, emotions surge, associations trigger, then consciousness retroactively claims ownership. You say, I decided, but many neural processes began unfolding milliseconds before you became aware of them. This does not mean free will is a simplistic illusion. It means consciousness may function less like a king issuing commands and more like an interpreter trying to organize forces already in motion. And this explains one of the strangest aspects of human existence. You can know something logically and still feel the opposite emotionally. You know you are safe, yet anxiety persists. You know the past is over, yet shame returns. You know a fear is irrational, yet the body reacts as though danger is present, because the brain prioritizes emotionally reinforced prediction over abstract intellectual truth. Neural pathways, strengthened through repetition, become cognitive defaults. This is neuroplasticity operating in both directions. The brain rewires itself according to repeated mental activity. Every recurring thought becomes practice. Every mental loop strengthens circuitry. Every repeated identity becomes biologically reinforced. The more the mind rehearses fear, inadequacy, resentment, or comparison, the more efficient those networks become. Eventually, the thoughts feel automatic because neurologically, they are. This is why people often confuse familiarity with truth. The brain prefers predictable suffering over unpredictable change, and the default mode network is deeply tied to that continuity. It stabilizes identity by maintaining a coherent personal narrative, even if the narrative is painful. Carl Jung warned, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Today, brain imaging reveals a biological dimension to that insight. Large portions of your mental life operate beneath deliberate awareness, constantly generating interpretations, emotional forecasts, and self-referential stories. The mind becomes trapped inside its own predictions, not because reality demands it, but because the brain is attempting to maintain continuity. And perhaps this is why so many spiritual traditions place enormous emphasis on silence, stillness, meditation, and observation. Not as mystical decoration, but as interruption. Because if the brain is continuously constructing the self through narrative, then moments of genuine presence may temporarily loosen the machinery generating that self in the first place. And once that begins happening, you start realizing the voice inside your head may not be consciousness itself, only one process occurring inside it. The most dangerous thing about the default mode network is not that it exists. It is that most people never realize when it has taken control, because its activity feels personal. The thoughts sound like your own voice. The memories feel objective. The predictions feel rational, but the brain is not replaying reality with perfect accuracy. It is reconstructing reality through emotional filtering, cognitive bias, and survival-based interpretation. Memory itself is not a recording device. Each time you remember an event, the brain partially rebuilds it. Emotions, current beliefs, fears, and identity narratives subtly reshape the memory during recall. Over time, you stop remembering the original experience and begin remembering the edited version. This means your identity is often built upon stories that have been neurologically rewritten for years. And once the mind identifies with a narrative, it begins defending it automatically. Even destructive identities become psychologically addictive. A person who unconsciously believes, "I am always rejected," will selectively notice rejection. A person convinced that people cannot be trusted will interpret ambiguity as threat. A person trapped in shame will unconsciously search for evidence confirming unworthiness. Psychologists call this confirmation bias. The brain searches for information that reinforces existing models while ignoring contradictory evidence. The result is a closed perceptual loop where the mind continuously proves itself correct, not because reality is fixed, but because attention itself becomes conditioned. You begin living inside a self-generated psychological climate, and the longer this continues, the more the nervous system adapts around it. Neuroplasticity does not care whether a pattern is healthy. It only cares whether the pattern is repeated. This is why chronic anxiety can become a trait instead of a temporary state. Why pessimism can feel intelligent. Why overthinking can masquerade as preparation. Why emotional suffering can become intertwined with identity itself. The brain learns the emotional rhythms it practices most, and modern society intensifies this process dramatically. Social media, algorithmic feeds, constant comparison, outrage cycles, and endless stimulation keep the mind trapped in continuous self-referential processing. The nervous system rarely rests long enough to distinguish direct experience from mental narration. You are constantly pulled into identity performance. How do I appear? How am I perceived? Am I succeeding fast enough? Do I matter? Am I falling behind? The external world becomes fuel for internal narration. A single notification can alter mood. A stranger's opinion can destabilize self-worth. An imagined future can trigger genuine physiological stress. The body responds to symbolic threats as though they are physical danger. Cortisol rises, attention narrows, fear conditioning strengthens, and gradually, Many people stop inhabiting reality altogether. They inhabit simulation, not virtual reality created by machines, but psychological reality generated by predictive thought. Friedrich Nietzsche warned that humans often become imprisoned by inherited interpretations rather than objective truth. Long before neuroscience mapped large-scale brain networks, he recognized that perception is never neutral. You do not simply encounter the world, you encounter your interpretation of it. And once identity becomes fused with interpretation, suffering gains permanence. This is why two people can live under identical circumstances while experiencing entirely different internal worlds. One mind remains flexible, the other becomes rigid. One updates its models, the other protects them. Because the ego is not merely self-esteem, it is continuity maintenance. The brain would often rather preserve a familiar identity than encounter uncertainty. Even misery can feel safer than transformation, because misery at least maintains predictability. This is why change feels psychologically threatening. Real change does not only alter behavior, it destabilizes the narrative structure the brain uses to define the self. And the moment that narrative begins cracking, many people experience something deeply uncomfortable: silence. Not external silence, internal silence. The sudden absence of compulsive narration can feel disorienting because most people have spent their entire lives inside continuous mental commentary. Without the story, they no longer know who they are. And that realization becomes the threshold between unconscious living and conscious observation. Most people try to change their lives by fighting individual thoughts. They battle anxiety with reassurance. They battle insecurity with motivation. They battle distraction with discipline. But this often fails for one simple reason. They are treating the content while ignoring the system producing the content. The real shift begins the moment you stop asking, "How do I control my thoughts?" and begin asking, "Why is the mind generating this pattern in the first place?" That question changes everything, because once you understand the default mode network, you begin realizing that awareness itself alters the machinery. Brain imaging studies have repeatedly shown something remarkable. During certain forms of meditation, mindfulness, deep present moment attention, and states of flow, activity in the default mode network decreases. The inner narrator softens. Self-referential thinking weakens. For brief moments, people stop mentally rehearsing themselves. And many describe the experience in strangely similar language: clarity, stillness, timelessness, freedom, oneness, peace. Not because reality changed, but because compulsive narration temporarily stopped standing between perception and experience. This is why contemplative traditions across cultures placed such enormous importance on observing the mind rather than blindly obeying it. The Buddha did not teach people to destroy thought, he taught them to witness it. Because the moment a thought is observed clearly, a separation appears. You notice something profound. The thought is happening, but you are also aware of the thought, and those are not the same thing. For many people, this becomes the first crack in psychological identification. You begin seeing that the brain continuously generates predictions, fears, simulations, memories, and identities automatically. Thoughts arise much like weather patterns arise. Some are useful, some are distorted, some are ancient survival mechanisms repeating themselves long after the danger has disappeared. But awareness interrupts fusion. Instead of becoming every thought, you start examining thought as process. This changes behavior at a neurological level, because attention itself reshapes circuitry. Thanks to neuroplasticity, repeatedly shifting attention away from compulsive rumination and toward direct experience can gradually weaken old neural pathways while strengthening new ones. The brain changes according to what it repeatedly practices noticing, and this rebellion is quieter than most people expect. It is not dramatic enlightenment. It is not becoming emotionless. It is not transcending humanity. It is learning to recognize when the mind is manufacturing suffering that reality itself is not currently demanding. You notice how often the brain lives in imaginary futures, how frequently identity is defended through repetition, how much emotional exhaustion comes not from life itself, but from continuous psychological commentary about life. And slowly, presence returns. You drink water and actually taste it. You walk without mentally rehearsing conversations. You listen without preparing responses. You experience moments without immediately converting them into narrative. At first, this feels unfamiliar. Then it feels liberating. Because the less compulsively the mind narrates the self, the more reality begins revealing itself directly, rather than symbolically. And perhaps this is the deeper irony. The self you spent your entire life protecting may have been, at least partially, a neurological process constantly reconstructing itself in real time. Not a fixed entity, not a permanent identity, but an ongoing story the brain keeps telling. Perhaps the greatest illusion the human mind ever created was the belief that you are identical to the voice inside your head. Because the more closely you observe the mind, the stranger it becomes. Thoughts appear on their own, memories reshape themselves, emotions arrive before explanation, identity changes across time. The self feels stable, yet neuroscience reveals constant reconstruction beneath the surface. The default mode network is not evil. It is one of the greatest evolutionary tools ever developed. It allows humans to imagine futures, preserve identity, build civilization, create meaning, and survive uncertainty. But when left unconscious, the same system becomes a prison of endless psychological narration, a machine that keeps replaying the past while fearing the future. And perhaps this is why moments of deep presence feel so powerful. For an instant, the mental theater quiets. The world stops being filtered entirely through memory and prediction. You are no longer standing outside life, analyzing it. You are inside it again. Directly. Viktor Frankl once wrote that between stimulus and response there is a space, and within that space lies freedom. Modern neuroscience gives that insight biological depth, because when awareness interrupts automatic mental loops, even briefly, the brain is no longer operating entirely from conditioned prediction. The cycle weakens, the narrative loosens, choice re-enters the system. And maybe that is what consciousness truly is. Not the endless stream of thought, but the silent awareness capable of observing thought without becoming trapped inside it. Not the narrator, but the witness. This does not mean you eliminate the ego or silence the mind forever. The brain will continue generating stories. It is designed to. But now you begin seeing those stories for what they are. Models, interpretations, simulations, survival-oriented constructions, not absolute reality. And that realization changes the entire structure of experience. Because once you understand that the mind is continuously constructing the self, you stop worshiping every thought it produces. You become more deliberate with attention, more careful with identity, more conscious of repetition, more aware of what you mentally rehearse. You begin choosing which inner worlds deserve reinforcement. And in that awareness, something extraordinary happens. The system that once ran your life unconsciously becomes visible. And the moment you can see the machinery, you are no longer entirely controlled by it. The mind constructs stories. Awareness reveals the storyteller. If this journey resonated with you, subscribe and continue exploring the intersection of neuroscience, philosophy, and spirituality with Selvion. Until next time, observe carefully.